Wow. Great intro, Dave.
You know, Toby, piece of advice to not necessarily to you, but to me. You shouldn't watch a countdown on the actual live stream on a different computer because you think you have another 10, 15 seconds, and then you turn over and I see you.
I just saw you in one corner. I wasn't sure if you were trying to grab a final bite of food.
No, the food's gone. We just have coffee and water right now, but I have another computer here where it's live streaming, and I'm like, oh, cool, I got another 10 seconds. Let me figure out what it is I'm going to say. And then I looked over, and you're staring at me, so turns out I do not have another 10 seconds. All right, that said, welcome to Labs Live. This is our February show. We have a once-a-month show, it seems to be. Yeah. And I probably got to put a little bit of housekeeping in there, right, Tobes?
Yep, let's go.
So go through, subscribe to our YouTube page, follow us on LinkedIn, all of our other social channels. And today we're going to be talking about app security. And so we've got some great guests. If you have questions, comments, feedback, drop them into to the actual comments, whether it be on LinkedIn or YouTube. Our guests have said they are willing to answer most things. I won't say all things, so be mindful what you ask. And we also have Diana in the comments helping to moderate and engage all of those good things. So, Toby, before we jump into the actual program, there is news, right? That I'm gonna bring up. I don't know if you know I'm gonna bring it up. So in between the January show and today's show, Toby got engaged.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But more importantly, Toby, Dave and I had to find out via Instagram. and I really like maybe you to address why we found out via Instagram as your co-host and producer here.
I'll have to say it did cross my mind a couple times, but that day, of course, is one of the biggest days of my life, and so many things going on in my mind. So if I didn't do it in the moment, it just kind of poofs, just passes. And you found out the next day, I think.
Yeah, before a meeting on Instagram. Well, Dave, we crossed his mind, but not enough to stay in there. So no excuses, Toby. All right. I think we're ready to jump into things, don't you think? Unless you want to break down your engagement more, because I could talk about that for a while.
I feel ready. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to introduce our first guest. Little bio here. Make sure I don't mess anything up. Toby can hold me accountable here. But our first guest is John Rondini. He's an experienced IP attorney and co-chair of Brooks Kushman Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice Group. John has helped guide clients through numerous and ever-evolving cybersecurity and privacy laws to develop policies, procedures that help prevent against breaches, and I think this one's key, Toby, for responding after a breach occurs. As a licensed patent attorney, John's work also includes protection, use, and development of IP rights, as well as enforcement action, make sure I got that right, against IP infringement and piracy. So with that, John, welcome. How are you?
Really good. Thanks for having me on.
Hi, John.
Hey, Toby. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we didn't tell any of the guests during our pre-show that you got engaged, and we were going to talk about that. So it was kind of nice to see everyone was surprised backstage. We are also joined by a couple Detroit Labs folks. One of them is Jackie Michl. She's a delivery lead at Detroit Labs, and Jackie has a wealth of experience from delivering for a large energy company, which of course is highly focused on security, but also a very large warehousing and logistics company. A big BI platform, again, needs to be secure, all of their data aggregated into one place. So Jackie, welcome.
Hello.
All right. And then our other guest is Brian Munzenberger. So Brian was employee number 8, Brian? Somewhere in there. I can see you, so you give me a thumbs up or down. 12. Employee number 12. So that was close. So he's been with Detroit Labs for a long time. Brian is a developer. Also had your role before you, Toby, the sales. So Brian has been in a lot of different roles, developing software for clients over the years, and a lot of different clients needing, COPPA compliant, PCI compliant. So he's got a ton of experience. And both him and Jackie really spearheaded our security work here at Detroit Labs. So Brian, welcome to the stream.
Thanks, Sam. Great to be here.
And I'm going to move Tobi and I down so we can really highlight the guests here. I figured I should acknowledge that I'm doing it so people don't just see people moving around. All right, let's jump into things. Tobi, did I get all the housekeeping stuff ready?
Yeah, that was great. And as you said, just a reminder, Diana from our marketing team is on both YouTube and LinkedIn. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to put them in.
Wonderful. All right, John, we're going to start with you. So there are let me ask you, I guess maybe this is an assumption, but are there laws in the U.S. currently that protect consumers from the fallout of a breach?
Well, short answer is yes and no. The easiest way to look at it is right now there's 50, every state has a data breach law as of, I think, 2 or 3 years ago, which means if there's a breach, they have to make some type of notification to consumers and possibly to reporting agencies and possibly to the government. Unfortunately, in terms of all the states or even at the federal level, that's kind of where it ends. There is now, as of last year, went fully into effect. California was the first state to have, a full privacy law put on the books, and provides not only the Attorney General the ability to bring enforcement actions. It also has a private right of action, which means that if there's a breach of, our data, my data, I could possibly file a suit against a company, a private right of action, a civil suit. Unfortunately, that's really the only law currently on the books. That went into effect last January. For those that don't know, in November, California upped their game, even though the law just went into effect. That's the CCPA. In November, they passed, a brand new law, and it's going to go into effect in 2023. And that's going to be, a very, very robust and probably the most robust law that will be on the books in the United States for quite a while. That's the CPRA, and that's the new law that will start, like I said, in 2023. And it's got some really interesting flavors to it. One thing is it's got its own independent agency that's going to oversee privacy. We have nothing in the United States like that. But that's the only state that has it. As of last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, Virginia, it just went through their House and their Senate, and it was passed. It's the next privacy law. So it's sitting with the governor right now. And as soon as that's signed, that'll be the second law on the books. And that'll go into effect also in 2023. So those will be the only 2 states right now that have a very robust privacy law on the books. Other states are looking to follow, and I think over the next 2 or 3 years, what you're going to see a lot of states really up their game, and a lot of states follow probably California's CPRA, the new one that just passed, because it's a very robust privacy law. So that a lot of states are probably going to start following that, but that's statewide, and that's a problem because that basically it's state to state. So you got to look at all these different variations and flavors and what rights consumers have and how it's enforced and what you have to do. And unfortunately, like I said, it's state to state, as opposed to having a robust federal law, which we don't have in place right now. If you look at other countries, most people are familiar with the GDPR, which is the European law. Some people might not be aware that Brazil last year passed their privacy law, so that's a new one that's on the books, and it's very robust as well. Canada's looking to follow suit. China is looking to follow suit. So there's a lot of countries out there that, at the federal level, they're going to put privacy on the books. We've kind of stalled. We have, 2 flavors of, laws at the federal level, but they keep stalling every year. So unfortunately, at the federal level, we have nothing except for possibly the FTC. The FTC has kind of been the quasi-federal privacy enforcement agency. And most people probably, if you're in the privacy realm, are probably aware that if there's a big breach, the FTC typically, or if there's, some complaint filed against a company in terms of privacy or in terms of how they're handling data, the FTC usually steps in, they do an investigation, and there might be some enforcement action or some settlement with the FTC, in which case a company might go under a consent order, and they have to comply to some degree with the FTC findings. But like I said, unfortunately, the short answer to your question is a yes and no. There really isn't anything broadly protecting consumers out there right now. It's a patchwork of different laws, varying from every state and at the federal level.
So knowing that it's yes and no, some laws, some not, are there clear guidelines that an organization needs to follow to adhere to any one of those laws, or is it kind of just trying to understand bits and pieces of all of them?
It's in pieces of all of them. A lot of people try to follow the most robust. So a couple of years ago, what everybody would be doing was either following the GDPR requirements or looking to the FTC. The FTC, when they file an action and they end up settling, what they do is they put out, some type of announcement, an order, and they lay out, possibly the allegations that were brought against the company, and then what the settlement, statements were and what the company needs to do. And those have kind of been the guidelines people follow, is looking at what the FTC says, may be good enough, may not be good enough in terms of, what you do with someone's data, how you're protecting it, what type of security mechanisms you have in place. Another law that's on the book that a lot of people follow is the Massachusetts cybersecurity law, which is kind of defines certain levels of security that a company should follow. But those aren't requirements, because the Massachusetts law, again, that applies only to residents of Massachusetts. So it's if you don't deal with residents there, then you really don't have to follow it. But that being said, a lot of people tend to follow that one or tend to look at the FTC guidance, because if there is a breach and there is an action brought against you, or there's some enforcement brought against you, if you have absolutely nothing in place, or you have very minimal security measures in place, then you might be hit with some type of a fine or some type of FTC settlement order. So at least having certain standards and looking at the laws that are out there, like I said, like looking at the Massachusetts law, that at least provides you some guidance as to what some states and some jurisdictions consider reasonable in terms of security measures to help protect the data that you are collecting and possessing.
So as an organization looking for a guideline, or at least looking to start a cybersecurity program, it makes the most sense at least to look at what's out there. You said the Massachusetts law. Is it about looking at precedent that's been set in court cases and a few different laws that are out there and doing your best?
That's exactly. So, I mean, if you look at the GDPR, when it first came out, no one knew really what was the minimal standards you needed to have. Now we're a couple of years into the law, and there's been quite a few cases that have come out, and the European, enforcement agency has come out and, set down guidelines. They've, enforced it. They've come out with orders. So you could look at those, past cases and look at what happened, looked at the security measures that were in place for those companies that were found not to be at a certain, level of security. And you can say, okay, this was found not to be adequate, so we at least have to have that. And if we don't have that, then we're probably going to be found not to be adequate in terms of security and protecting people's, data. That being said, it's evolving daily, monthly. So unfortunately, it's one of those areas that you actively have to stay on top of it. I think over the last 5 years, what we've seen a lot of, and I think most companies have recognized this, is the rise of the CISO role, the security operation aspect of it. So, and that came out of people recognizing we can no longer just collect all this data and then possibly have a breach and do nothing with it, or just go, sorry, I didn't realize we didn't have secure measures in place. It's gone way beyond just having an IT organization or IT infrastructure in place. You got to have IT communicating with some type of a security officer or some type of person who's in charge of privacy and data, who's overseeing it, who's talking back and forth with all the different aspects of a company, with your marketers, your engineers if you have them, salespeople, all the way down to your lowest levels, your office administrators, or anybody who has any access to your network. I mean, the one problem you have now, and we've seen a lot of this over the last year with, really with respect to COVID, is the attack vector surface. It used to be limited to just possibly your, internal office, and you had a server and you had some, computers there. Over the past year, with everybody working remote, that attack vector surface has grown exponentially. So now you need to have somebody who's overseeing all that and making sure not only is everything, people at home, they're working secure, but how are they accessing the network? What are they accessing? Do they have authority to access that? Should we shut it down? Should we limit them in terms of what they're accessing, the data, and where it's going back and forth? Do we need to transfer data from Michigan out to California, from California over to Europe, or from Europe over to the United States? Data is flowing so much now. It's such a fluid exchange between not only within a company, but between a company and vendors. You have to know where it's going, and you have to know what you're transmitting and who has access to it.
So I think it's a great transition over to the implementation of this, right? You talked about it's important for organizations to have certain things in place. We're talking about guidelines being a little bit messy. You have to do a little bit decoding. So I'm going to move over to Jackie and Brian here. And so for organizations in a world where you're trying to get things to market, it's competitive. You're trying to get software done, get out there. How do you make security a priority?
Yeah, it's a great question. At Detroit Labs, we started by looking at it from a personal perspective. Each of us are users of these applications, lots of large applications that have a lot of information about us. A lot of it we freely give to these organizations. I personally have been a victim of a data breach, and it doesn't feel good. There's a personal violation that you feel when that happens. Not to mention the hassle it can be to try to unwind any of the damage that is personally caused, which is what got me into it. As a professional software developer, I'm also on the side that is creating this software, and I want to make sure that I am doing my due diligence personally and with the company that I'm working with to make sure that the stuff that I build is secure. I don't want my users of the software that I build to have to experience the same personal feeling of violation that the data that they entrusted to me has been breached. So at Detroit Labs, we decided to implement security in all stages. John is exactly right. It's not just in the realm of the developers or the people who have technical roles in the company. It starts at the very beginning with our business development team understanding what the security requirements are from the client perspective, and all the way through from initiating a project through development, testing, deployment, and even the maintenance at the end. So the way that we prioritize the security is throughout the entire software development lifecycle.
That's great. And so I like that personal passion very much came into the organization, right? And created a strong focus on that. You also talked about, and John in a previous conversation talked about, yes, obviously if a breach happens and there's personally identifiable information, so PII, that is certainly bad and it's kind of its own thing. But tell me a little bit about reputation being on the line, which seems like it's a little bit decoupled from PII. Any breach really can harm reputation.
Yeah, actually, absolutely. When considering your different attack vectors, not only do you as an organization have an ethical responsibility to build secure software and protect PII, but you also need to think of it from a business perspective as well, and the potential business impact from a security breach, not just the technical impact. And the business impact is where that loss of reputation comes in, which can be the most damaging thing, because if you lose your reputation, then you as a business can go under. So not only did you fail to uphold your ethical responsibility, but there can be pretty significant financial impact that's a result of a loss of reputation.
So like as a developer or engineer, whichever role, like watching this, we talk about the organizational level, but from not every organization is there now. You, Brian, and our team here at Labs have made things happen. If I'm watching this stream and I wanted to start sort of like spearheading a little bit in my organization, start having those conversations going to create that sense of responsibility, what would be like some thoughts that you could share with like a developer like myself who want to do something like that in company ABC, for example?
I can answer that part. So I think the best place to start in my mind is like a concept of like secure thinking. So like John kind of mentioned and we talked about, there is no real checklist to say, okay, I did this, I did that. And even if there was a checklist, that checklist would be constantly changing. So the best place to start is in the way that you're just thinking about security in the software development lifecycle. And there's a tool, like a thought process tool that we teach in our security training at Detroit Labs called threat modeling, where the purpose of threat modeling is to just analyze the system that you're building and I identified the different attack vectors. And so rather than taking an approach where you're trying to check things off of a list, like, did I do this? Did I do that? You look at the potential vulnerabilities or ways that PII could be accessible based on your architecture. And then you take a mitigation approach rather than a checklist. So like going through that thought process of looking at the design or model of your system, identifying what we refer to as assets, like those things that you want to protect, the things that you don't want malicious or negligent parties to get a hold of. You start building that out, and then you code or you implement things to protect those items. So you're not going off of a checklist, you're going off of like the architecture of what you've built and the things that you want to protect.
And just following on that, I mean, when I talk with clients, and it's very similar, no matter what the company is, no matter if it's, you're talking about developing a software app or, just in terms of, you're a sales company or a mom and pop sales company, and you're collecting a lot of, information from customers and clients. The first thing, I go in and I tell my clients is you have to know what you're collecting. You have to know the data. And then to the point that Jackie was just making, you got to kind of look at it, and then you got to look at the data or look at all the information you're collecting and say, who needs to have access to what? Mm-hmm. Sometimes the marketers and salespeople need to have access to, certain types of information, but they don't need to have access to everything. On the flip side, if you're an engineering type company, engineers by nature want to have access to everything, but that's not always, especially in today's day and age, not feasible, but not, something you really want to implement. So you got to segregate the data for them too. And people don't like to do that because it takes extra time. It takes a lot of money to do this. It takes manpower to do this. Somebody's got to segregate this data out. But in the world we live in now, with the amount of data that's out there, it has to be segregated and broken off. And you do have to put up some type of barriers to certain groups of what they can access. You don't want to have unfettered access by everybody in the organization to anything. So when you're, to Jackie's point, when you're looking at it at the very get-go, you got to look at the app or whatever it is your business is, your core focus is. You have to look at it and say, okay, if we're going to start from the ground up, what is our core business? What are we collecting? What are we trying to develop? What are we trying to produce? And from there, you got to start, to Jackie's point, setting up barriers, setting up protocols that, you'll implement along the way to make sure that, not only malicious, but negligent. That was something Jackie brought up. I mean, that's where most of the breach is happening. I mean, your phishing attacks, your deep fake attacks. Those are big ones now too. That's where the real breaches are coming in. It's by somebody who accidentally receives an email, opens it up, clicks a link, and all of a sudden it's giving access to, some type of malware that was unintended. It wasn't something that somebody did maliciously, but it was negligent. And all of a sudden, if you have all this data just sitting in a big honeypot there, you're going to expose it to anybody who has access, be it negligent or be it malicious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent point, John, and something we talk about throughout the entire security training that we give to Detroit Labs employees is this principle of least privilege. And that is one of the first things, absolutely, that you should do. And be honest, like who actually needs access to what, even within a development team. So if you're a services organization like Detroit Labs and you have multiple clients and multiple teams, does every single person on the team need access to every single tool? But then that concept of principle of least privilege can also extend to the end user as well. So if you have account management within the software that you're building, what user needs what access actually?
And I would add too that it's not static. It's constantly changing. Mm-hmm. So at Detroit Labs, we're constantly rotating team members between projects and clients, and that we advocate in our class that there should be a process when somebody comes onto a team, evaluating what access they need. When somebody rolls off, how do you gracefully remove access to things that they no longer need access to?
Yeah, and that becomes a hard thing, like I said, because then you do have to have somebody who's in charge of this. And like you said, Brian, when somebody's rolling in and rolling off, you're granting access, taking away access, granting access, taking away access. And the issue is companies are like, well, I just would rather just give them full access and not have to worry about it. Then I don't have to worry about it anymore. The problem with that is if that person accidentally becomes the negligent party and they have complete access to everything, that whole honeypot of information is now possibly breached. And at that level, getting back to all these different laws, well, you might have exposed yourself to way more laws and way more breach notifications than was necessary if you would have segregated that person off.
So I want to, for Brian and Jackie, I want to touch on something here. You talked about training a couple different times. And I would say we went through a journey when it comes to training. For organizations, is that something that you can just write a check for, go out and get it, and here's a class, and you're trained up? Or maybe you could talk a little bit about our journey. Is it more in depth than that?
Yeah, so we sought that out ourselves, and it sometimes I think it might depend on what your organizational needs are. Unfortunately, it didn't work out very well for Detroit Labs. We have very specific needs. Our clients have very specific needs, and there's no like standardized body out there that says this is what security training is. This is how organizations should do training. It very much is customized. So what we discovered after surveying that landscape is that we needed to develop something internally that met Detroit Labs' needs for the kind of projects and clients that we have for our software development lifecycle, and what makes sense to protect Detroit Labs, our clients, our users, from anything that could go wrong with security. It has been a top priority for us and the people involved in creating this work group to create stuff that is actionable within our organization and kind of eliminate the noise.
It's great. I think actionable is a key thing, because oftentimes there's a lot of energy spent around theorizing when it comes to, that's what Tobi, I don't even know if that's a word, so you'll have to help me at some point here. But not putting things in like tactical implementation, like, just thinking about things. So I think that journey has been interesting to watch, and is largely led by folks like yourselves that's just passionate about this, whether it be personal experiences or, clients have needs, and we need to make sure that we're secure in our development.
And as like someone who has taken the training, I can affirm that like it's very actionable. Like coming out of the training, like even in my role in biz dev, there were like things that I learned from the training that I'm able to incorporate going forward. So great job to you both and the entire AppSec team.
It's actually something that I have to commend you guys on, because that's something that I think most companies don't realize, is that there's not a company out there that can come into, any one company, know your whole infrastructure, know all the tools you're using, know every aspect of your in and outs, who's doing what, and be able to train you. I mean, that's why you can lay out plans in advance, but when it comes down to the actual training, I mean, companies can come in and do, some high level training, but to get down to the nuts and bolts of your everyday functionality, it's something an organization has to take on themselves. They have to put that mechanism in place. And, it's not something you can just do once and then, never have to look at it again. It's something, annually, biannually, you have to have this training so that people are on top of it, know the new tools, know the new, areas of law that are out there, and what they need to do inside of their organization to, keep the data safe.
Right. I think we've talked a lot about checklists, and I think it's really easy to fall into this trap that, oh, this law requires annual security training of developers. Let's just bring in a third party. Well, how useful is that going to be? Because you may be checking off a box, but is it going to be useful for your teams and your software development lifecycle? You might as well create something that is custom to your organization so that you can fulfill that ethical responsibility that you have, rather than just checking off the box. And that's ultimately one of the reasons why we decided to develop our own internal training, so that we could make sure that we were training our teams and our team members on what's important for Detroit Labs clients, what's important for our agile process, not a waterfall process, or even just like the unique role that we play in the application environment, because we can be working with a variety of other vendors or database architects on the client side. So we really needed to adapt our training to the way that our teams work. So like Brian mentioned, team members could walk away with actionable items that made sense for the project that they are on today.
And that the one thing that I like you keep stressing is the checkbox or checklist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think a lot of people fall into that trap thinking, oh, well, if I just check this box, if I bring in some third party and they come in for a day and they, give me some high level training, then I've checked that box, I'm good. And the issue with that is like we were talking about earlier, there's so many laws out there, both within the US and outside the US. And it's an ever changing field. And if you just try to check that box and have somebody at a high level come in, you may not actually meet the reasonable security standards that, not only the laws, but the cases that are coming out, the opinions that are coming out, the orders that are coming out from the FTC have determined not to be reasonable. So to have internal process to really know what your organization is doing and really stay on top of the privacy and continually doing the training and making sure that what you're doing is actually not only at a checklist level, but at a true ethical level secure, then you're going to have a better chance if something happens. I mean, we talked about, a breach. It's going to happen to most organizations, if not all organizations. That's something that all organizations have to accept at this point. There probably will be a breach. What you can do afterwards, your reputation is going to depend on what you did before the breach. So to your point, setting up these processes inside your organization and really trying to develop them is something that's going to, if a breach does happen, it's going to have big ramifications after, not only in terms of whether or not you're found to be negligent in terms of not meeting certain standards, but also in terms of, your business reputation. I mean, if you can go out and say, well, we did everything we can, we did, X, Y, and Z, we had these training going on, it's going to help your reputation down the line too.
So one of the things I want to kind of want to get back and highlight that I think is really important here is secure thinking. We've talked about it, but I think what's you've heard probably design thinking when it comes to product development, which just obviously means design, bringing it to the forefront and keeping it in mind throughout the entire experience. And I think secure thinking is just as important, where you're bringing it to the forefront and you're making it a critical component throughout the entire thing, instead of just at the very end saying, okay, well, I have to be compliant with this one thing and let me make a couple changes. So I do think, I really want to highlight that for folks watching, that secure thinking is critical, because it's a mindset, but it's a mindset that also prepares you for the ever-changing world of technology, because what we know today will not be true in a month, 2-3 months from now, as things are always changing. So embracing it like a mindset, and I think it's critical there. And John, you mentioned it's not if, it's when it comes to a breach. So we just talked about all the different things that an organization can do, in more specifically what Detroit Labs is doing on the preparedness, preparation, training side of things. So the early stage of this, so as an organization, if you've come to terms with this notion that it's not if, it's when, what do you have to put into place to prepare for that?
Well, I mean, from the very get-go, I mean, the training and everything is one aspect, but that should be, part of an overall privacy strategy. I mean, typically you want to start with, assuming you're going to be breached and having some type of plan, some incident response plan put in place. And you're going to want to focus on putting the right people in place, and not just having it, to Jackie's point, be a checklist that, sits on a shelf or sits in some folder on a server somewhere and never sees the light of day. It should include people that can respond to the breach, that are knowledgeable about the inner workings of the company, that know the privacy and know the aspects that you're trying to protect, know what the data is that you're collecting, what data you have, and then can analyze and work with, a forensics team, work with outside counsel. If it's inside counsel you have, work with your inside counsel to determine how to respond. And it's not always, I mean, a breach might happen, but that doesn't always mean that PII was breached. And I think that's a problem that a lot of people, don't understand. They go, oh my gosh, we had a breach. We have to notify every customer. And then they come to find out after doing a forensic audit that truthfully, it wasn't. It might have been, your personal pictures on your computer was what was breached, which in that case, there wasn't really a breach of customer information, of PII. So you didn't need to make a notification to all the customers. So you could end up harming yourself by not having a plan in place and going through the plan when a breach happens. And like I said, I mean, the plan should have certain aspects to it. It should define the breach. You should be able to look at it. You should have, a certain number of people that are within the organization knowledgeable. Those are your first contacts. I mean, your head of your IT probably would be one of them. Somebody at the director level, and then you have a couple of security officers possibly that are in play there as well. In addition to maybe outside counsel, maybe a third party forensic examiner that can come in and analyze what was breached, what was accessed. From there, you need to, determine what tools you might need to manage the breach, and what steps you're going to need to take to address the breach. Like I said, there's two flavors here. There might be a breach, but it might not trigger any laws. And in that case, you might not need to make notifications. Or the flip side is PII was accessed. Okay, now which states do I need to notify? Or if it's international, do I need to contact international bodies? If it's only residents of Michigan's data that was breached, well, then I'm limited to the Michigan law. I don't have to follow the CCPA because I didn't have a California resident whose information was breached. So that's the overall arching plan that you need to have in place, and it's something you should set up well up advance of even starting down the road of a project. It's something that it gets back to Jackie and Brian's comments. I mean, this is something you got to have at the beginning before you even start down working on a project. Collecting information, you should have that all in place, develop it, and then it's something that is always evolving. I mean, every year you got to come back to it. Look, oh my gosh, this person left. We got to add somebody new to this team. We have to train them. We have to, work through the process. Maybe even have a couple times a year, or maybe once every other year, at least go through it, have a fake breach, and just go through the plan, see if it works. Because it's just like, it's like practice. It's practice getting ready for a game. If you don't ever practice it, when the breach does happen, you're just kind of running around. So it's better to have the plan in place, have it set up, and then actually run through it a couple of times and make sure it actually works.
The common theme I'm hearing through this entire stream here today is planning and prepared. So don't get caught after the fact. Don't scramble after the fact. It's okay. We're all human, right? And so you certainly don't want something to go wrong. But in the event that something does, having that plan gives confidence and can help to reassure, whether that be a client, whether that be a consumer. I think that's an important piece of what we're talking about here. So I'm gonna jump to advice. So I think the last couple episodes we've been ending it with our guests kind of giving out a little bit of advice, and I think this is a great topic to have that for. So for Jackie and Brian, what advice would you give to an organization looking to make security a priority?
I think for me, I would focus mostly on the mindset first. I mentioned threat modeling, and we talked about that quite a bit, because that mindset is going to be more adaptable, more flexible than whatever implementation tools are out there right now, because the world of technology is always changing. So if you can become a better problem solver, if you can exercise and practice those skills of identifying potential threats, then you're going to be much better set up to mitigate, because you can always look up implementation details. How have others protected this thing? How have others handled this situation? What's the best practice right now? But knowing how to look for risks and perform a risk assessment, that's a skill that's gonna carry with your organization for a very, very long time.
I would add on to that too. There are likely individuals in your organization that are already passionate about security. Find those people and empower them to help drive these kinds of practices in the organization. That's basically how it happened at Detroit Labs, and we've been very successful with it. I would also reiterate kind of what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes, and that is creating a plan for when a breach, I would argue, inevitably is going to happen. You can be defined, like you can be defined by how well you respond to that, and that's something that we drive home in our security training as well.
That's fantastic. And John, I'm gonna go to you for a piece of advice, but it also ties in quite nicely to a question we just had. Are there auditing? The question is, are there auditing steps that should be put into place to avoid different types of security breaches? And my question to you is very similar. What advice would you give to organizations to protect themselves from bad actors?
Well, there's a couple of steps. I mean, in the auditing question, I guess, are we talking about auditing in terms of after a breach or before a breach?
Well, I think in this situation, because they're trying to avoid the actual breach, as part of the process of developing something, putting something out there, are there steps like auditing that could take place to help with that?
Sure. And so there is. I mean, you can, depending on the type of organization, and this gets back to what Jackie and Brian were talking about. You have to set it up early and know your organization and know your possible attack vectors. A lot of companies now that they'll do some type of either, penetration testing or some type of, security testing from the outside to see how secure their network is. And they do that as a terms of an audit. And that's something, the question about an audit is something you should set up in your incident response plan. It's not something that, like I said, the response plan doesn't necessarily have to be just okay, a breach has happened. Here's the steps I got to take. Your plan should be fully comprehensive, and it should be include possible yearly scenarios, yearly tests. And this term that you're talking about in terms of an audit. And the audit should be knowing your organization, knowing possibly where the breach could occur or where you think the breach might occur, and then working with a forensics company. And there's plenty out there that we work with and that we recommend, that they'll come in and they'll do certain types of security tests and see where possible vulnerabilities are. And once you're able to look and say, oh, okay, we didn't realize we had a security breach here or a possible security breach here, you can close that loophole. I mean, one of the biggest loopholes right now in the past year has probably been vendor vendee type access. And I'm sure at this point everybody has probably heard and it's been beaten into the news so much about the SolarWinds breach. And the SolarWinds breach was probably the worst vendor breach that has ever occurred. And that happened, and it was one of those ones that if it wasn't for one of the most high profile security companies out there, FireEye, recognizing that there was this malware sitting in their system, then that breach might still be going on unsuspected, unknown. So in terms of an audit, that was one where FireEye was actually auditing their own system. They were doing their yearly or monthly, I don't know to what degree because they didn't really disclose, but they were doing a check of their system and it was uncovered. They found it, they disclosed it, and then it was disclosed from there. And then everybody, including most Fortune 500 companies, realized that they possibly were exposed to it. So, the patch came out immediately. But that's something that has to happen. If you do not go out there and actively audit your system, it should be more than yearly. And in terms of an audit, it gets back to something that Jackie brought up earlier in terms of training. There is no one, size that fits all companies. Every company is different. The data they collect is different. How they use the data is different. What they're doing is different. So you have to know your own organization. And this gets back to what Brian just said, is you have to have people inside the organization that are somewhat passionate, that can work with not only outside counsel, but outside, auditing companies and say, okay, here's what we do. Here's what we need you to kind of test. But if you have other recommendations on top of that, that's great. But here's the core of what we need to test. And then once you test that, then you can build upon that and keep building out and determining what else you need to test to make sure that whatever information you're collecting, whatever PII you have, is staying safe, not only from the very start all the way through development, but to Jackie's point, then to release and then to customer interaction or customer interface, after the product's release. So auditing something that needs to come in with the plan. It's something that you should start with. I mean, it should be at the very beginning, way before the breach happens. And it's something that you should be continually doing because, one of the themes we've been talking about is not only are the breach laws changing every year, the way people are getting breached, the tools that, not only state actors are using, but, smaller parties are using to initiate breaches is changing all the time. I mean, 4 or 5 years ago, ransomware wasn't really a big threat. And now over the past 2 to 3 years, especially in the energy sector, the healthcare sector, down to basically every sector now, that's become a big problem. So you need to not only be auditing your system, but knowing, okay, if a ransomware attack, that's the new type of attack, we should have backup systems so that if we do have a ransomware attack, we have a backup system. We don't have to pay the ransomware. We can shut that system down and we still have all our PII. So those are, the auditing is something that should happen, but it has to go into effect early on.
All right. Tobi, I think we're gonna wrap things up here. We're at that magical time, approaching that magical time of the stream. Do you have any final questions for the great group that we have here?
No, more like just like a summary. I know we talked about a lot of things, and from what I'm hearing, it seems like if you want to be like secure, like take security seriously, it's a lot about preparedness and the mindset that we have just about secure thinking. And the associated part of being prepared is having like regular checks. You don't have to be breached first before you start auditing. You just have that as part of your thing. So for me, it's like just the takeaways. for companies or for developers is to have that mindset, and also to be super prepared when a breach does happen, because it looks like we no longer have that, oh, I will never be breached if I do all these things in a checklist. It's like when it happens, I really like Brian's response when he talked about the way you handle a breach could be even defining of how serious you take security. So for me, no any additional questions. I'm just really thankful for all the insights you guys shared today.
All right. Awesome. Well, Brian, Jackie, John, thank you so much for joining us. Going to send you backstage. Hold tight. Tobi and I will wrap things up, and we'll chat in a minute.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tobi, you summed it up so beautifully.
Thank you. I learned a lot today.
You just eliminated the need for me to do that right now. So I greatly appreciate that.
You're welcome. It was like there was just a lot of things that stood out that you could just take out of it too. I feel like the way the conversation went very organically, it helped to think securely, like just the analogy you used with design thinking, and go ahead with preparation and how do you prepare and stuff like that. It was so easy to digest. So I'm glad that we did this.
Well, it's interesting too, because it's such a large topic, but also confusing at the same time. So when you have something that is so large, so important, coupled with the fact that it's a bit confusing, right? Because there are no clear guidelines out there, and you're doing a little bit of decoding, a little bit of interpretation. That is very difficult. And I think in a lot of ways it can be scary. So it was great to talk through, what is out there, what you should be looking at, and then how to implement that in your organization. And so with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. Don't forget to like us, subscribe. There's so many words now. I'm not even really 100% sure what I'm supposed to say to do.
Thanks for the comments. People were commenting and asking questions.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Hey, Elise, by the way, thank you. That was a great question. It's almost like you had my notes. You didn't, but it worked really nice. Follow us on all our different social channels. We appreciate you tuning in. And Dave, do you want to play us out?